and good evening, wherever you may be. On Steampunk Radio with two E's, which you're listening to, or some in the world today. You never know. Radio goes in all directions, and where radio goes now. But sometimes Dr. Lenny, your host, gets really out there, and so he's been talking to his analyst. And here's some Annie Ross from 19 to tell you what her analyst told her.
No more it's our answer, but oh no. As a child, I appeared a little bit wild with all the crazy ideas. But I knew what happened, I knew I was a genius. What's so strange when you know that you're a wizard in dreams? I knew that this was meant to be. Well, I heard little children were supposed to sleep tight. That's why I drank a fifth of vodka one night. Paris got frantic, didn't know what to do. But I saw some crazy scenes before I came to. Now do you think I was crazy? I may have been only 3, but I was swinging. They all said, hey, Grandpa. They all said, and that's what I said. So why should I feel sorry if they just couldn't understand the reasoning and the logic that went on in my head? I had a brain, it was a thing, so it just let them laugh at me when I refused to ride on all those double-decker buses. Because there was no driver on the top. I didn't listen to his jive. I knew all along he was all wrong, and then he thought I was crazy, but I'm not. Oh no. My analyst told me that I was right out of my head, but I said, dear doctor, I think that it's you instead, 'cause I have got a thing that's unique and new. It proves that I'll have the last laugh on you, 'cause instead of one head, I got 2. And you know, 2 heads are better than 1.
That was Annie Ross, 1959, on a television show called The 420 Club. Now, I found it interesting that it was called The 420 Club because in watching television of that era, I always thought everybody was drunk on TV. I didn't realize that they were stoned on TV. But 420 has an interesting origin. In 2003, the California Senate tried to pass Bill 420, which was introduced to regulate medical marijuana in deliberate reference to the status of 420 in the marijuana culture. An unsuccessful 2010 bill to legalize cannabis in Guam was also called Bill 420. So what we got is that 420, either the number 420, the time 420, or the date 420, is slang in the culture, which means, hey, it's time to smoke. Especially for smoking at 420 every day, because that's what time your body's endocannabinoid system needs more input. You're starting to wind down, and now everything's becoming ratchety and out of sync, and you want to put it back into sync. So if you think about what's in sync and what's not in sync, back in the day when they were talking way back when, the television shows that used to be funny were actually really funny, and the quiz shows that I used to watch were hilarious. But then they started changing up the quiz shows, and what I found was that going back and watching the quiz shows, I learned more trivia about the way that things worked than I did that I knew on the other hand. I mean, I was watching shows like Jeopardy and Who, What, or Where, but one of my favorite shows was called The Hollywood Squares. And The Hollywood Squares was actually a rather silly show. And they would get a whole bunch of comedians and they'd play tic-tac-toe. And when somebody called in for one of the squares, the comedian in the box got to crack a few jokes. And so I thought it might be nice to take you back to the days of Peter Marshall and the Hollywood Squares in 1972. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this episode, and Mel Brooks is on the cover of the episode. I haven't heard this show in a long time, but I guarantee you that my experience with this show is that they will say a number of things that we didn't know they could say on TV, and it might give us some idea as what the censors allowed back then as opposed to what the censors allow now. So without further ado, I'm going to take you back into the 1970s to television quiz shows.
Hey, welcome back to an evening of X's and O's as the Hollywood Squares Marathon continues. Now, in this next episode, taped in October of 1972, Paul Lynde gets a little frisky about a question on airline procedures, making it an instant classic. And joining Paul we have the very funny Mel Brooks, Michael Landon, Vincent Price, just to name a few. So take a look, and I think you'll enjoy it.
One of these stars is sitting in the secret square, and the contestant who picks it first could win a prize package worth over $2,000. Which star is it? Michael Landon, Lee Grant, Red Fox, Vincent Price, Wally Cox, Rosemary, Mel Brooks, Linda Desjardins, or Paul Lynde, all in the Hollywood Squares. And here is the master of the Hollywood Squares, Peter Martin.
Thank you very much, Kenny Williams. A very good evening. Welcome to the Hollywood Squares. Hello, stars.
Hey, Peter.
Go ahead, attack the jacket, folks. Mel, your first comment.
Yes, Mr. Interlocutor.
That's it. I read with your code, and Michael, we could go out, and I got a great name for the act, Stump and Stumpy. Yes. Our Miss Circle this evening is Karen Myers. Welcome to the Hollywood Squares, Karen.
Thank you.
Nice round of applause for Karen Myers, please, audience. Karen is a housewife, mother of two, married to a general manager of a car lot.
Yes, there's a lot there.
Yes. Well, we wish you luck this evening. Yes. Mr. X is Ken Smith. Hiya, Ken.
How do you do?
Nice to see you. Ken Smith. Ken is a teacher and water polo coach, married to a teacher. They have a young daughter, and we have a commercial word or two or three, and we'll return and play a secret square game worth over $2,300. Roll either across but not a diagonally. It is up to them to figure out if the stars give me a correct answer or making one up. That's how they get the squares. Every game completed is worth $250, and the person who wins the most cash tonight will win a brand new car. In addition, in our first two games, they play for a secret square. Mr. Williams.
And Circle starts the secret square, which includes this handsomely styled sofa by Kraler, one of the world's largest makers of upholstered furniture, performance-tested fabrics, deep-seated comfort from Kraler, and a certificate to Dairy Queen. Let's all go to the Dairy Queen, where the whole family can enjoy America's favorite sundaes, delicious shakes, and other frozen treats. And from Brunswick, the fabulous Dunham home billiard table, one of the finest made. It's fun for the whole family by Brunswick. Plus, a complete line of his and her cosmetics, makeup, and skincare products from Vanda Beauty Counselors, Division of Dart Industry. And Kimball Swinger Organ, amazing new feature. The entertainer makes beginner sound like an experienced musician. Play a simple one-finger melody and select rhythm accompaniment of your choice from Kimball Piano and Organ Company.
To show the home audience the secret square. As you know, the stars are briefed before the show to help them with their bluffs. Karen, I understand you won the toss backstage. A good start. To whom are you going?
The one and only Paul Lynn.
The one and only, Mr. Only. True or false? Some airlines now give you a thorough frisking before permitting you to board the plane.
Well, that's the only reason I fly. Frisking on the body.
Yeah. Where else? Some airlines, a thorough frisking.
I'll tell you, I'll be honest, you know, it's like we had a question about, you know, why celebrities, what is the first, you know, we always get the tables. They always pass me through, they don't. I've never seen actual body searching. I think that's false.
I disagree.
No, it's true, Paul. It's true. With a circle. Ken, your turn.
One touch, please.
You are in Africa, and you hear a deep roar like a lion's. Is it possible you just heard the voice of an ostrich?
I resemble Vincent Price.
Thank you, Wally. I think you do, too.
How about this thing in Africa? You hear a deep roar like a lion's. Is it possible you just heard the voice of an ostrich?
Yeah. Oh, yes. I thought I heard an ostrich.
He said yes.
I agree.
It is yes. They sound very much like a lion. And so you watch yourself. And we have an X there and a circle. And Karen, your turn.
The beautiful Lee Grant.
You went to Lee Grant? Yes. Hi, Lee.
Hi.
According to Cosmopolitan, do you read Cosmopolitan? Oh, okay. But according to them, it has been described by one expert as the art of relaxation. Another calls it the oldest known system for health and happiness. What is it?
Probably an Eastern way of relaxing, such as the Zen things or the yoga or...
Karen?
I disagree.
Yes, yoga, in fact, and we can't accept that. So we put an X there. Can a break for you?
Rosemary, please.
And that's it for the Hollywood Squares for today because the jokes are just a little too dated. Instead, let me give you a better version of what we should get from our television game Yeah, and this is their co-host, Right On Washington. Right on, right on, right on, right on, right on. That was Cheech and Chong from back in the 70s. Let's make a dope. Now, as we get into the 2020s, we are approaching the point where nothing is serious and everything is deadly serious. And so we've got a world that is whirling. And if you spell world WHIRLED, you find that it spins at a different pace than the one you were comfortable with. And the pace that the world spins at is known as the frequency. And each of us is attuned to a different frequency. So the world that we live on spins at a different pace than the world that everyone else lives on. And so time is a necessary sync, SYNC sync, so that we're all on the same page talking about the same thing at the same time. And so if we want to have a radio show that starts at 7 o'clock in the morning here on the Pacific Coast and starts at 10 o'clock on the Atlantic East Coast and starts at 2 in the afternoon on the Atlantic West Coast off of England and starts at 3 p.m. in Belgium, then we all have to coordinate our time patterns and get onto the station at the same time in order to be part of the live radio event. However, how much time it takes to get through our 24-hour day is something that is normalized to each human being, so that if I have 20 seconds in my minute and you've got 60 seconds in your minute, my 20 seconds and your 60 seconds are set to be equal because a minute equals a minute by definition. And you see, these scientists, they have a way of defining things so that once you have a scientific definition of how things are going, then the objective is to get your science together using your objective definitions and make an explanation that makes sense. And so to start off, you have to design an experiment that allows for enough variance that you know what's going on, but is under enough control so that you know what the options are, so that what you're trying to find by the experiment is narrowed down in terms that the experiment gives you a distinct answer. And so experiments in science are designed on the basis that first you have a hypothesis. And one of the things that I learned in school that apparently not many people learned in school is that when you write something, you write it first. First thing you write down is you write your title. And before you've even figured out what you're going to be doing, you got to name what you're doing something so that you know what area you're in. So you write your title, and then you write an abstract. And the abstract is what your conclusions are going to be at the end of your experiment. So if you are doing your experiment right, you want to know what you're expecting from the experiment and why you're expecting that and all the highlights of the abstract. And then you write an introduction, but you don't write the introduction first, you write the introduction last. You write the title first, and you write an abstract so that you know what you're looking at or what you want to conclude. But the very next thing you do is you look at the conditions that you're dealing with, and you start deciding which variables you need to hold constant so that these variables, which you know affect the result of your thing, aren't going to be causing the effects that you're looking at. And in chemistry is an interesting science because the science of chemistry is something that you can write down an equation, you can balance your equation, and sometimes the equations aren't all that easy to balance, but every equation has a balanced key so that whatever you start with and whatever you end with all have to end up in the same place. So if I start with 15 different atoms, at the end I have to account for 15 atoms. And if it takes me multiples of the 15 atoms, I can work with 30 atoms or 60 atoms or however many atoms, but all the atoms in the start and all the atoms at the end have to be the same number of atoms. You can't make new atoms. You can't lose any atoms. So the balanced equation accounts for all the atoms, and half of chemistry is just making balanced equations that work for you in your own mind, because they have to have starting materials, and the starting materials have to have some participation, and that participation has to lead to a changing of the bonds, and that means that it has to happen at a significant rate so that we can see it, and it has to happen in a way that there's a transformation from one chemical to the next chemical. But fortunately, that happens all the time, and even if we can't see it, we know it's there. So, for instance, our body takes in oxygen on the inhale, on the in-breath, and then when we exhale carbon dioxide. So somewhere in the body, in the time it took us to breathe in the oxygen got used in a process called metabolism, and the product of the metabolism, carbon dioxide, got to fill the lungs so that the exhale after inhaling air provides an exchange. The oxygen replaces the carbon dioxide, the oxygen going in, the carbon dioxide going out, and it works just like a shuttle bus. So that once the shuttle bus is filled with its quantum of carbon dioxide going out, it goes out, releases the carbon dioxide, new oxygen fills the bus, and the bus takes it in. And this happens, 100,000 times a second or something like that. And because you have so many molecules inside you doing the same thing, what converts the oxygen to the carbon dioxide is something in your blood known as hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a fairly complex molecule. It's probably got up to 1 million Daltons of weight, which means that the sum of the weight of all the atoms exceeds 1 million, where hydrogen equals 1, carbon equals 12, oxygen equals 16, and so forth. And so the organic chemistry, the scaffolding of your body, consists of carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen and oxygen in all sorts of different combinations that make sense by the balancing of electrons into shared things that we call bonds. And all the scaffolding has what's called a covalent bond, which means it's shared between two elements. So everybody in the scaffolding has to sing Kumbaya and be on the same page. If you take that analysis out to the real world and put it on people, that's what some people are saying. We need to get it all together, and every human has to be on the same page. And I, in one sense, tend to agree with that, and in another sense, tend to not agree with that. I do believe we all have to get on the same page, but I think no amount of coercion is going to get us on the same page. What we all have to do is think for ourselves and come to the same conclusions. And if we think for ourselves and come to different conclusions, let's have conversations on what those conclusions are and how we achieve them, and be sociable and affable in our exchange of how things work and how things doesn't work. Now, yesterday was an awesome show. I had Carrie Wolf here, and we talked for 2 hours. And after the show, she said something to me that really made me think and happy to be a radio talk show host. She said, you know, that's one of the very first LARPs I've played on where people didn't score by attacking each other. And the thing is, we don't have to attack anything. There's plenty there that doesn't make sense in the scaffolding that has been built for us based on the way it has always been, which it has always been that way in our lifetimes because they changed everything. And the last significant change that they made to everything happened back in 1945 to 1950. And they had to totally demolish the entire set of the world and make it so that all of the places that were established as the set for the whole entirety of European history from 1492 through 1850 was totally deconstructed in the 80 years since 1950 to now, or 1940 to now. And that's because they had to change the playing field to get different ideas out amongst the populace. And they couldn't get those ideas out amongst the populace with the family as it was structured, taking care of everybody and allowing the human population to be comfortable in who they were. But you see, we had this great revelation, which probably was not a real great revelation, but sometime in, after World War II, no, wait, let me get my history straight. Bing, 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 bing. We're going to go in 80-year periods back into history right now, and this is New Way history, so there is a crypto-fiction element involved in the telling of this history. But if we jump back from now 80 years, we're at 1940, World War II starting. If we jump 80 years behind that, it's 1860, and we got the Civil War going. If we jump 80 years before that, it's 1780, and we've got the Revolutionary War going. So we jump 80 years behind that, and we get to 1700, and I don't believe there was a major war going in 1700. So that's where we want to be. What was going on in 1700? Well, in 1670, they had this guy named Galileo Galilei, and Galileo Galilei was an astronomer, and he was studying things from the famous astronomer Plato and looking at different things, and he came to the conclusion that we were not a Earth-centric thing, we were sun-centric, and that the Earth moved around the sun rather than the sun moving around the Earth, and that humanity was not the center of the galaxy on Earth. That was a kind of rough revelation, but that's what the data said, and it was after much soul-searching that he came out with that, and immediately the king attacked him, and immediately the Pope attacked him, and he did the honorable thing and bled himself out in a bathtub. And, maybe that's the first example in history of somebody being arc-incited. But Galileo was the preeminent scientist of the times, and he had a lot of notable friends, and the intelligentsia were all got their panties bunched in a wad, because if the king, who wasn't very bright, and the pope, who wasn't very bright, were going to go after the intelligentsia for being very bright, they were going to have a problem on their hands. And so they looked around at who was the brightest human at the time to solve the problem, and they found this guy named Isaac Newton. I like Ike. He ran a good race in 1956 and became president of the United States. and then helped to get John F. Kennedy elected as his successor, and told us all about the deep military industrial state that we had to pay an eye on. And, you know, we stopped paying an eye on it at some point, and you reap what you sow. But let's go back into the historical annals of what Ike Newton was trying to deal with the king on one side saying, off with their heads, and the Pope on the other side saying, this is my world, off with their heads. And Newton was a very shrewd scientist. You know the old story. He invented gravity by getting bopped on the head with an apple. Don't believe it for a minute, but he was a pretty bright guy. He was also a deacon of the church. So he absolutely was in line with the Pope, and he knew that the key feature that the Pope was interested in was keeping his domain be the domain of life. And if the Pope had dominion over everything that was living, based on this Gutenberg press thing now being published called the Bible, that he was happy with allowing the science to continue. But if science was going to have consciousness and be part of the Pope's dominion of life, he wasn't going to let them go that way. So Isaac Newton had to figure out how to get life out of science and science out of life. And so he came up with the story of bouncing an apple off his head, figuring out some complex mathematics that would be like calculating how far you could throw a frisbee if you were a 10-year-old right now. But most people at that time had no formal training, and explaining the concept of gravity when everything fell to Earth, he had a pretty good theory. He managed to pull that one off. What's even more interesting is that here, 320 years later, 4 cycles of 80, according to Strauss and Howe, we have the same belief in how gravity works. Except for some of us who've advanced science beyond physics and chemistry and biology to that point where it makes alchemical sense once again. But alchemy was banned around that same time, and that's when they broke the sciences down into things. And so you had chemists going on studying gases, and the thing at the time was phlogiston. And phlogiston was that component that animated life in immaterial things. And so if you could animate something with phlogiston, you could build a Frankenstein. And Mary Shelley, when she wrote Frankenstein, worked on that theory because it's all an allegory. In fact, most of the books you read are allegories because history didn't really happen. It was made up by the victors of wars, and it goes in a cycle. But as long as they can change the set on the cycle, we don't even realize that it's going in a cycle. And if we're patterned to live 80 years and the cycle is patterned to live 80 years, every one of us gets one chance at that changeover point at some time in our life. And if that changeover point is coming in the next couple of years, well, hold on to your hats, because one morning you're going to wake up and the big director in the sky is going to say, okay, that's a wrap, and slap his little thing together. And all of a sudden we're beaming up with Scotty and flying off. And so it really seems that where David Wilcock and some of these other Gaia TV folks have gone is into space to create space in the image of what space is possible. Because when they were writing about space in the 1950s and Isaac Asimov was writing his Foundation series, space was a complete unknown and they didn't know how to get there. So they made a whole bunch of things up, and by and large, 80 years later, that's the plot of the next show, is space, the final frontier. So the aliens are going to rescue us, and we're all going to go off into space happily and live ever after. Only it sounds to me like the Hansel and Gretel story. But, you know, there's a lot of cookies for those children who are eating the gingerbread house. You wonder why some of these stories were so scary that they told us growing up way back when. But, you know, we don't tell stories so much anymore because we let the televisions tell the story and the movies tell the story and Hollywood tells the story. And Hollywood has become so holy weird that they're telling us stories that just aren't true and changing the ending of the stories we know and love. But if we don't have context to know how they changed the story on us, we have no idea where the story's supposed to go. So we can step back and analyze the story of what's going on in terms of Isaac Newton 320 years ago being at a cusp of history where somehow they avoided the war to end the whole cycle. And if you look at the cycle of 80 years and you use Strauss and Howe's analogy that every 80-year period is a different season, we are coming out of the winter season and moving into spring. And to get from winter to spring, according to Strauss and Howe, you need an event. And that event happens due to a gray champion. And 320 years ago, the gray champion was named Isaac Newton. And he came through and saved the civil society and led us into a science-based world where animate life wasn't part of science. And it wasn't in the next period of 80 years where it took us from Newton up to the Revolutionary War, but all we get out of the Revolutionary War period in American history is about the battles and the things that happen, and it's a very much a glorification of war behind the idea of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and a number of other heroes and patriots who they've had 200 years of molding into shape so that you know all the good things and you don't know any of the bad things, and the story has morphed enough times that it makes sense to be palatable on any level. But if you go 80 years further than that, what we've got is a civil war that's come up because the industrialized North and the food-producing South can't agree on trade relations, and the North realizes that if they don't spend money on food in the South, they won't get to eat, and they didn't want to spend money on food, so they decided, okay, we'll just take over, and went and destroyed the South to take over. And this was really before the Midwest became the breadbasket of the world. But if you look at the American history of the 230 years that we have, it's pretty much a history of rolling over the landscape, conquering territory, moving wilderness out, and building civilization. And if you look at the building of civilization by stepping back and playing the game Civilization, you can really embed yourself in an awesome world that takes you out of the current reality but gives you the building blocks of the current reality and allows you to see what you can do with those building blocks that are different from the way those building blocks have been brought up to now. But we're going to have to rebuild the civilization that we have from scratch in another way, because we don't know what the event horizon brings, but there's something on the event horizon that has happened in other moments of time currently, but has not happened on this planet in this moment of time because of my multiple worlds hypothesis. It's not Dr. Lenny Time's multi-world hypothesis. There are many people who have written on the multi-world hypothesis, but the way the multi-world hypothesis works is that we are on a timeline of our own creation, and at different nearby frequencies, there are different timelines that are parallel to this timeline, and they go in waves. And those waves build up to a crescendo, and then they decrease to a minimum, and then they go back to another crescendo, and they decrease to a minimum, and it works just like the in-breath and the out-breath, where you take your breath in and inhale everything and get all the oxygen that you need for a while till the next breath. And then you exhale all the carbon dioxide that your body has produced and get it out there and blow it out, and continually priming the pump, because you as a human organism have a function in nature to convert oxygen to carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide that you breathe out goes to the trees, who can use it as primary building blocks and put on leaf material and release oxygen, so that we have more to breathe and they have more to breathe. It makes you wonder if cutting down all the trees on Earth is a real good idea. But in some places, they've managed to denude the earth of trees, and those places don't have a very long shelf life once there's no trees there. But I do believe that the history of Earth that we've been given is subjective and incorrect, and that if we want to use it as a basis set for what we understand, we are taking it at the risk that we're believing something that was created to make people believe something that was created off a belief that people wanted to believe something. And so if we get three derivatives deep into the I believe based on this, based on this, based on this, without double checking to see that all the things that we assumed in each of the three levels of the experiment all are valid assumptions, then we're not going anywhere. And that's one of the problems with scientism today, is that nobody's out there testing what the knowledge base to see what's valid and what's not valid. And we had an event that changed the skew of some of the timelines. So instead of being in a parallel stream, we shot off a few tangents. And those tangents are necessary. It's how time evolves over time. But evolution doesn't work in linear jumps. It works in fits and spurts where you deal with something, there's changing conditions, and so the adaptation to the changing conditions is what transforms the reality to something else. Now, we have a problem in our definitions, and there are certain terms that we use in an absolute sense that are supposed to mean the same thing to everybody: up and down. When we say up, it means look at the sky, find the sun, find the stars. When we say down, it means look at your feet, look at the ground, look what's under there. What if we've got it backwards? What if intelligence gets higher at smaller sizes because it's more compact and they have to do a lot more with much more limited resource, and that as you get bigger and bigger, you get less actual coordination of things, and that the game of life is to understand the relationship of smaller growing to bigger rather than just going bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. We live on a finite-sized planet, and we cannot have infinite growth. And so the infinite growth model of the monetary economic system is over. We need to replace it with the balanced growth of a balanced reaction in chemistry. So Isaac Newton wasn't a chemist. He was a physicist. And he worked with people like Cavendish and some other chemists. I think Lavoisier in France was the one who figured about oxygen. That was about 1820 or 1830. And it got to the point where chemistry was becoming developed in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. But then the big war in the 1850s and 1860s demolished all the previous history that everything had stood on and recreated history from a vantage point of 80 years ago. The American Revolution took place, and now the Civil War is taking place, and we're gonna save the Union. And realize this is still, what, 160 years ago? And they already had the Revolutionary War 80 years after Newton, and that created the breakaway society where we could try new things and be sovereign. And the Civil War was being reeled back in by the banksters, but they didn't win the Civil War. They just caused mass destruction in the United States and changed the way things were to the way things are going to be, because everything had to be rebuilt, but there was a lot of land to expand to because nobody gave the land credit for its own ownership, and the caretakers of the land were of the red race, and Europe just didn't consider that they were real people and owned the land because they didn't consider that they owned the land. They worked in partnership with a living earth. And so the idea that they could be run off, and they were tricked a number of different times. They were diseased because Europeans brought diseases over that Indians had never seen. But I hate to call them Indians because they really weren't. That's such a biased term. But if you look at history of how they got here, we could have had them migrate from India. You never know. But I really don't think that anything in history is real. I think it's all just scaffolding to get us to where we are. And the purpose of the scaffolding is not to drive primary events. And so in chemistry, I would call the scaffolding all of the organic chemistry that makes up the biology of humans and other things. But we're not quite there yet because biology wasn't really a concept of science back when Newton invented it. And by the time Darwin teased enough to come out with the theory of evolution in biology, that was really the beginning of biology taking off into a new sphere. And biology was always supposed to be based on chemistry. But you know, the biology is not based on chemistry. Biology is based on the whims and thoughts of biologists who don't necessarily understand or comprehend deeper truth buried below biology, just as most chemists don't worry about or understand the deeper truth of chemistry based on physics. But the physicists understand the deeper truth of physics based on the fact that physics is accepted from measurements that describe the way that people think and take measures of, except that theoretical physics has gotten so far off the deep end that they can't pull it back into tangible reality. And so you get places like CERN that are so far out of what's going on, talking their scientism crap, that people who have bought into the scientism that we can explain everything through this understanding of inanimate science created by Isaac Newton have no idea how the living earth is going to change their realm entirely. Because the idea of the planet being alive and being living means that it has primary rights over itself, and that we better rethink ownership and property rights all over the place. But that's okay, because right now most of the property of Earth is owned by corporations, which are run by banksters, and that's the narrative that we've been given. I don't think it's a knee-jerk reaction to think that a number of people are upset about the whole form of governance because they've been sold a bill of goods over the 18 years of their educated life that has them believing that everything is good, fair, in truth, justice, and the American way. And you can spell way, W-H-E-Y, because it's a porridge of bad ideas that have been piled on each other by the form of governance that gives educated people more say than non-educated people, to the point where we've developed a whole class of educated idiots who are looking out for their own benefit and don't consider themselves people. But the alignment of who you're aligned with right now makes absolutely no sense, because you're either with us or against us, but none of us can articulate reasonably what it means to be with us or against us. So many people are out there shooting the messenger of difference, no matter what anybody says. If it's different, we got to object to it. And that's all part of the control mechanism. Take a step back and look at who's being loud. The people who are being loud have an agenda to push. If somebody's loud, step back, see what the agenda they are pushing is. Does it agree with your agenda or does it not agree with your agenda? If it does not agree with your agenda, please turn them off and go find people who you can listen to who agree with your agenda. Because likes like. Nobody likes it when people troll them because they have a different opinion. But this idea that we all have to express our opinions, and if other people don't want to believe them, hey, that's okay. They don't have to believe them. What's true to you is true to you. And if you're going to change your belief based on other people's unjustified opinions, what were you believing in the first place? Each of us has a belief system that we own and cop to, and mine just happens to be chemistry. If I can figure out a chemistry mechanism for how something gets done, I'll allow it to be in a realm of possibility. But if I can't find an analogous chemistry system that works the same way something's being explained to me, then I'm going to be dubious of that system because I can't find an analog. But if it's something new and somebody's come up with a new idea and it really needs to be worked with, I can't reject that idea unless I have a number of different forms of proof that that idea needs to be rejected. And one of the failings of scientism from a very base start is the idea that it's false until proven true. Because there are things like consciousness that can't be proven true under current variables, but we know that consciousness exists, but that gets all the way back to Newton 320 years ago, partitioning consciousness out of science to appease the Pope. And so here, 320 years later, we still have the same types of religious persecution. The Pope's been in charge for so long that people fear that the priests are pedophiles, but that's just a narrative. And unless you've been in a closet molested by a priest, you don't have the basis set to be able to talk about it. Now, some people have been molested by priests. Some people have been molested by paper boys or uncles or other people. I mean, there's no question that people do molest other people and it's not really good behavior, but the motivations of why people do things and the fact that they've done them are two completely separate entities. And we've confused people's motivations with their actions for too long. Most people's actions are based on the practical need to get by in their lifestyle. And let's face it, if you don't go out and buy food, you don't necessarily eat unless you found somebody who can help you with the food process that you don't have to go out and buy food. But you have to provide something of worth to that person to cover your food. And you know, food's always been abundant and free in this world up until the capitalists came and decided that they could make money by having everybody pay for everything they need on a regular repeating cycle. So you look at the electric company and you wonder how much work really is done by the electric company for the revenues that they collect by having a monopoly on how electricity works. And then you look at these power companies and stuff, and they're all owned by the same people. And you realize that we've got something called 0-point energy on the horizon, and this 0-point energy has been on the horizon for all 80 years that we've been living. And the reason it's on the horizon was because it was here in the 1920s, and they got rid of it and disappeared it so that people wouldn't understand how to create 0-point energy, so that they could roll it out as miraculous and take a whole nother several generations to give us information that we already had. Information sequestration by the elites has to stop. We have so many penalties for disclosing things that are secrets when what they're teaching in college doesn't make sense, because everything's an industrial trade secret, and they had to create befuddlement to protect their whole economic system. It's nonsense. Economics doesn't have to be done with money. You could do it by pushing electrons, but chemistry and economics are two different things, and the only thing that chemistry does better than economics is it accounts for everything in a model that's finite, instead of accounting that the earth is an infinite producer of natural resources, and that we as humans with dominion over the earth will claim all those resources for ourselves. And if you look at all the political stuff that's going on in the world today, what really ought to be scary is the stuff that they're talking about, where the Russians have bought all the uranium from the United States mines to start refining for military-grade weapons or something. Uranium is radioactive and is not a real good thing the way we've been taught, but how much of the nuclear chemistry that we've been taught has been made up in our lifetimes? Well, now that some of the people who were part of the system of making it up have passed away, everyone still alive has had this as a system in their lifetime, their whole life. And so we've reached the point where corporate culture is no longer functional on human scale, and we as humans have to find a better way of dealing with each other on human scale that's outside this body of law in which corporations are persons and we have no say anymore in what's going on. So that even if we wanted to stop chemtrails because they're bad, or can stop 5G because we don't know what the vibrational frequency of resonating near the Schumann resonance will do long term to the population of humans. They're not doing experimental science because they know everything's going to change in a year, because they have facts of history that we haven't been presented. But those facts of history that we haven't been presented are there because we have had them presented to us. We've just wrote them off because Blavatsky, she didn't know what she was talking about. Or they've buried people and made them disappear, like Tesla, which most people think is a car, and which Elon Musk has created such a puppet show around. Elon Musk is a fictional character. He's a creation of your own mind. He doesn't exist, but they needed to roll him out as a transition to get us from the here and now into the space age. And they did a lot of work, and it really became that we were either going to get the space age and the Jetsons, or we were going to get total destruction and rubble back to the Flintstones. And fortunately, it seems like the space age has made it ahead of the Flintstones, although there's enough neocons in the government right now that I wouldn't give it one last great shot at totally popping off the world. But I don't think that's going to happen because we're here on a living Earth. And the idea of a living Earth means that if we're going to have trade to get natural resources with the Earth, we have to do things that the Earth finds of value so that it will grant us those resources. And by living outside for the last, I think I've been outside for nearly a decade. Yeah, I moved outside in 2011, 2012. No, it had to be 2011. because I was living comfortably in Ashland, and I realized that the lifestyle that I had in Ashland was the same exact lifestyle that I had run away from in the previous life, except inverted. And so instead of being on top of the game, I had managed to get back in the game at the very bottom. And I could have climbed my way through the game and played the whole game just the way they suggested. But instead, I decided to create a new game for myself. And the new game was something that I had been playing since 1999. I've always been a game player, and my game in 1999 was when I realized that when NAFTA and GATT passed, and I got terminated from my good job as a lab supervisor and hired at the same salary as a chemical consultant to the same company in order to close the mine, and was given a bonus to, because when they closed the plant, everybody got termination pay and all that. And so I was set up pretty nicely. I had money in the bank. I had a regular salary coming in, and I had no responsibilities that I had to report to on an 8-hour day, but I still had responsibilities that I had to take care of. And so I essentially chose to retire and take care of my farm. And that was the cultural mistake that I should not have done, because instead of playing the game and trying to crawl up by withdrawing from the game, I no longer had a stake in how things went above the level that I was playing at. And I no longer had the access to information by having a supervisor feeding me what I needed to know about how things worked. And boy, when you get to the point where you're approaching 40, 50 years old, and the world suddenly makes sense as being nothing like the world you were brought up in, but it crystallizes in appearance, and you go, oh, snap, that's how that works. And you have to come to the conclusion that you can't hold two different opposite theories in your mind at the same time, have them both be true. And so you have to give up on one theory or the other. But if you give up on both theories simultaneously and just let it all go, you get to a different place that not too many people get to. And the air is much clearer out here. And once you realize that what other people think are important is not really important to you, and you can go your own way and choose what's important to you and develop that pathway into something, now you're no longer at the mercy of the system, and your choices of how you choose to make decisions are once again important on human scale. And the more you leave the system and find alternative ways of doing things that are footprint neutral in the scheme of nature, the more nature is there to offer you opportunities to come up with ways of doing things that are unconventional by the way humans do things, but would fit in really, really well with our ancestors in the 1800s, the 19th century. But that sort of lifestyle before gasoline, before electricity, was set up in such a way that the modern innovations of lifestyle, especially in the city, took people on a tangent that moved them from the extended family situation that they had into being isolated into components in a non-living system that Isaac Newton created in 1700 because he had to appease a pope and a king and wanted to save his own life. And his solution was so good that it did last for 320 years. And the king made him the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he actually had control of all the king's money in Britain for the rest of his life. And the Pope was really, really happy because he had domain over the earth and they had found a compromise with the king. So the king and the Pope didn't have to fight anymore. And the king didn't adopt Christianity, but he didn't persecute the Pope. And now we're at the point where you look at modern history, and 320 years later, that solution that Isaac Newton came up with has totally unraveled. And so here we are in the new way in a crypto fiction novel, creating things based on the realities of the past, but it works that the past is only the future in disguise. It hasn't happened yet. And that we're in an endless loop of this 80-year cycle, where the 80-year cycle runs in 320-year cycles. And I'm sure the 320-year cycles run in a multiple of 4 of that. And that we're looking at a doubling function. And the doubling function is a parameter that is there as one of the limits, but Fibonacci and the doubling function operate under 2 different upper limits, and we are well below either one, so it doesn't matter which one is in actuality the upper limit, but the doubling function takes over from Fibonacci somewhere in the billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions, somewhere in that area, where once you get over that hump, you no longer get a boost of return on the back end. You get a straight linear 1-for-1 relationship. And that's where we are with the monetary system. That's where we are with the political system. It's where we are on the Earth governance system. And so to come back to reality, and instead of complaining about the personalities who run things under the way they've been taught to run them, if we can step back and come up with entirely new, different living systems and figure out how things work and get it to there, that we might just have a way of doing things differently enough that it'll get some legwork with the general public. But that way is that we must each be individually self-sufficient and sovereign in our actions, but coordinated in such a way that the actions that we are coordinating and being sovereign in are in no way seen as a threat to the current powers that be, that currently perceive everything that anybody does as a threat. And so they are in threat response mode, and they've paralyzed us to the point where we have a fulcrum, and that fulcrum is 50% on the left, 50% on the right, but of the whole, 50% has been excluded from either the right or the left by the nature of the debate and how things go. And so I think that the real thing to do would be to find the new way on steampunk radio with 2 E's. And if you search for steampunk radio with 2 E's, then that should locate you onto the site from the TuneIn app. And if that all works, we're going to have another listener in a moment. And I have lost my place because I had to respond to Skype. But, every so often when Skype breaks in, it is worthwhile to respond to it. And that's just the new way on Steampunk Radio. I'm Dr. Lenny Time. I'm in the process of giving good monologue, but sometimes the monologue can become a dialogue. And so if there's anybody in the chat room who'd like to open up a dialogue, please feel free to mic off. And I think what I'd like to dialogue on is the idea that if we can come up with a different system of accepting truth to where validated truth can be held and taught to each of us, and we all make the attempt to poke holes in validated truth, then I think what we can do is come up with a new form of validated truth that we know is true, instead of this form of truth now where truth has to be a response to lies from the mainstream. Because if it's based on a lie from the mainstream, how can you make truth out of it if it's based on a lie? So I'm confused. Sometimes the confusion is honest. Sometimes the confusion is not quite honest. But the way I see it is that too many people who we've been told to trust are completely dishonest and disingenuous. And in order to understand who's on the level and who's disingenuous, you have to look at the motivations of the position that they play in the role that they play in the world, because the role that different people play in the world and the role that they actually fit themselves into usually have some sort of correspondence to each other, but the portrayal by the media of how the world works is in fact no way at all how the world works. And if we can't get a grip on working the world on human scale, where each human has the importance of being sovereign and able to make their self-determination of what they want to do within limits that the society can handle. But right now, those limits are such that we can't even have an honest debate about topics that we honestly are concerned with. And so if we can't debate the vaccine issue because they want to shut down all voices that are anti-vaccine, why don't they come clean and explain all the components that go into vaccines and exactly why they're used there, so that the adjuvants that are not chemically good for us but seem to be necessary to hold the vaccine together have an explanation that makes sense. And while we're at it, please tell me how aluminum and mercury have become bio-tools of professional medicine when neither one has a significant role in natural biological systems. Mercury does have a role. Mercury comes naturally. But, I mean, if you've ever been to a mercury spill on a piece of property, you'll realize that the mercury is no problem at all in the form of mercury. It's just that the control system has such an expensive mercury remediation thing that as soon as they get a chance to remediate mercury, they see dollar signs and they chase it. The real problem is lead, and every municipal drinking water system has a criteria that allows it to put lead in their water. That's a crime right there. If the EPA were actually an environmental protection agency, they would have laws that make sense by the laws of chemistry in natural systems, so that the things that we didn't do didn't harm the earth. But you see, the disposal of industrial waste right now is significantly harming to the earth, and we don't have no say. Not only do we not have no say, those of us who are trained in the area to have say have no say either. And the scientists have been browbeat into being part of the supporting cast for people who just don't have a clue and don't have our best interests in mind. But do we have our own best interests in mind? Can we tell? Do we even know what our interests are? Or are we too busy playing with the political system of control, which is superficial and has nothing going on that is really relevant, except it keeps our attention completely off everything that's completely relevant behind the scenes? So they do a lot of things for our protection, but I do not think the watering down of teaching science to the public in the high school and university college system has served us as the public very well at all. And I think we, the people, need to come up with a different form of governance that works on human scale. And that if we want to have a complete world human governance, the way to do that is by disarming everyone and peacefully coming to the conclusions of who represents us locally and building local areas so that they are all autonomous, and then reaching a built-up level from the human scale where we develop cooperative efforts once the size and scale tells us things are necessary. And if you go back to playing that game Civilization, the Civilization game by Sid Meier's is now through 6 renditions on the internet because it has value and it's not a shoot 'em up game. And there are so many shoot 'em up games that just create the shoot 'em up mentality that we've got. And I'm as guilty as anyone in watching shoot 'em up reality because most of the movies that I like are in the way that things work, and things don't quite work the way they ever seem to work. And so sometimes your talk show host loses his way because he's nowhere in the moment and he has adventured into places that are even worse for him than the chat room. And so I am going to take a moment and recollect my thoughts, and I am going to find something to put on that's entertaining because I need to take a breath and get my head into a place where I can do something different than what I'm doing now. But I seem to be running into the problem of mind of its own. And once you get to a computer that seems to have a mind of its own, things don't work. And so now I have come to the conclusion that the way this is all working is just set up to not work the way it's supposed to work. And that no matter what I want to do, I can hit any key that I want, and it'll take me to a different place than where I want to be. So what I have figured out is that sometimes the radio show host reaches a point where he just talks too much. And if the radio show host talks too much, the only thing to do is to slap him down with a song. Oh, don't do that. Rhythm is not playing.
Well, while we're waiting on that, I would like to invite our listeners to visit your blogs on steemit.com/@LennyTime, THYME. Look through those blogs and you will find yourself a link to our Discord server, where you can join us in the Ornery Radio Clubhouse and be part of the live studio audience. And hey, you might even get to talk to Doc on your own.
I don't know. Does Doc talk on his own?
Sometimes.
So why is it that Ridley didn't want to play the song that I put out?
You know, I am not sure. I would assume it's a bot issue. It's got all the permissions it needs to do everything here in the server. So,
well, I'm under the place where I'm having problems because the server is jumping all over the place, and it is not doing what I have asked it to do. And so I'll try it again, but yeah, we had a talk with our bot, and we talked too much, but we needed to clear the bot, and once the bot got cleared, the bot needs to smoke more marijuana. That's the only thing that I can see, is that the bots don't have the ability to inhale. But I had a nifty problem that I think I just solved, and Skype tends to be an issue when it crosses my path when we're in the radio show. But in some ways, you really don't want to disconnect, because once you disconnect, your connection goes wonky. And so I'm doing some white magic. And the white magic that needs to be done is slowing down the pace of time so that the pace of time that I have gives me enough time to switch gears while I'm timing things, but doesn't necessarily change anything in the reality of the flux. And so, day after day, alone on my hill, the man with a foolish grin is keeping perfectly still. And so I can watch and I can look down the hill, And I've realized that things don't like to come uphill, but if you're really into it and you take your time and you work your way into a going uphill situation, that what you find is a slight upgrading slope works very well for those of us who need to advance. But the advance that we feel we need to make is often something that we can reunite with on the descend and come back off the advance without necessarily changing the fact that we have advanced. So I've got a theory that there's at least 3 different timelines that are in play, but that the major 2 timelines and the Living Earth New Way timeline are distinct. So the New Way Living Earth timeline is on a cycle that's on a 26,000-year cycle. And I think that people who are on half that, a 13,000-year cycle, are also still here on this earth. And that people always are on their own daily cycle, the 13 moon 28 day cycle. And we have taken the 13 moon 28 day cycle and changed it into the calendar and morphed it around so that it doesn't really work exactly like it has been explained, but it does work to the point where the explanation is something that people can buy into and not give it any more thought. I needed another puff because I'm going to go into some deeper thought right here. And it's going to take me a little moment because today is the mind loving day and yesterday was the mind powering day. And because of the way that I'm on a cycle, mind loving leads to mind sounding. And when I'm in the mind areas of my 64-day tree day calendar, I tend to overthink myself because I'm supposed to mind what my mind wants to do, and I'm getting ready to go into a void cycle. And in the void cycle, I like to give up on doing any practical work. And so the definition of practical becomes really what is at stake here. And I don't believe in doing things that have no purpose. On the other hand, I think that to think that a purpose has to be practical is just not something that really makes sense. I think that as we go into the depth of what science is and the depth of what scientism is, we've lost the main concept that science is about things we don't know and coming to make explanation for the things we don't know, whereas scientism is saying that science has all the solutions. And if science has all the solutions, then we've got something wrong. And if we've got something wrong, then the first thing that we should use to explore what we've got wrong is the science. But if science has all the solutions, we can't use science as a tool to explore science. And so if science isn't useful as a tool to explore science, what do we have that can really explore across the depth of the science? And so we'll figure this one out because it always is one of those things that the depth of science is 1636. And so 1636 is 1636. And 1636 is a magic number. And once I send it off, then we'll see where it comes the next time. But don't you love how the internet makes things just mess up entirely because it's the internet and they can do that? And so many people are just used to the routine of dealing with the Facebooks and the Amazons and the way things are set up to be easy for everybody, that when they come to the point where things don't quite make sense, they default back to something that says, okay, this made sense, this is what we'll do. But in reality, I can't do more than one thing at once. And trying to be in the moment, I can't be in the moment and have multiple conversations and still floating. And so it works that way until my screen with Skype stops pinging me. I'm going to have to just float, because every time that Skype screen comes up, it distracts me once again. And so all I can do is all I can do. And nothing I can do is anything that I can't do. So I just got to keep doing what it is that I do. And what I do is what I do whenever I do it, because that's just the way things work. And so this is the New Way Radio Show on Steampunk Radio with 2 E's, which you're listening to on your TuneIn app. And Discord is something completely different from the TuneIn app. But to get into Discord in my room, the best way to get to Discord in my room probably right now would be to go out to Steam it at Lenny Time and go into the last post that I made and look for the hot link that says Discord and use the hot link that says Discord to come into the room. But I'm going to guess that that Discord hot link is probably expired because it was over 24 hours ago that it was posted, and we don't necessarily put out permanent invitations, because then that means that anybody could come into the room, and we don't know quite how that works in reality. But we do know that when it doesn't work in reality, we have a mess, and that trying to deal with Skype and Discord both at the same time always creates a mess. But if you figured out how to deal with the mess, sometimes you can do something real. And I'm just pushing buttons on my computer again because the tablet just isn't responding to what I'm asking it to do. And so if it takes an extra 5 seconds every time you hit something before it responds, I just don't know. I'm going to sit here and look at a tablet that isn't responding at all. And so now it won't even get me back into Discord. And so I have no idea what it's trying to do. Please, please don't pop things up on my screen. Microsoft. I think that sometimes Microsoft is just there to generate loosh on all of us. And if we continue to generate the loosh that Microsoft wants us to generate, we're going to set over back into a pathway that we've already gone past. So I'm here to say, let's not dive down that rabbit hole. Let's not allow Microsoft to make any more decisions for any of us. But then again, how can we not allow them to make decisions when they own Skype, they own the software in the computer, and they insist on upgrading anytime they want because they feel that they have the right to? And unless I shut off everything, I don't get a chance to play this game. And I like it when things are just comfortable like they always have been. When they change and make it so that it's different from what it was, it always takes me a little time. Hell for Apple users. Welcome to hell. Here's your PC. Hell for PC users. Welcome to hell. Here's your PC. Absolutely, I can relate to that cartoon. It's one of those things where the whole idea of an Android is a ripoff, and the industry has been allowed to rip off innovation for so long by the virtue of printing its own money that everything worth owning is owned by industry, which has reams and reams of knowledge that it's sitting on because it's just not profitable to share with us people. And we believe in it because we were taught to believe in it, not because we really understand it. And the whole system that we're taught under starts with counting. And if you count in a linear fashion, you think in a linear fashion, and that's part of the game. We got to break out of this thinking in a linear fashion because we don't have to be anywhere where we are unless we're there. You know, there's another there out there, and you can get there, but you have to let go of the reality that's here. And if you let go of the reality that was here, there's no guarantee that you're going to get back into this same reality. And that, I think, is part of what the Mandela effect is that people have been changing their own reality to the point where their own past no longer got them here. And so what they believe happened to them in the past did in fact happen to them in the past, but in a different place, not the here that we are in the here and now. And so coming to grips with your here and now means having some sort of constant situation that keeps you grounded into where you are. I do not need the hiccups right now. We've got 20 minutes left in the show, and the hiccups are not welcome. Oh, I need coffee, marijuana. That's all I need. If the show has coffee and marijuana, I'm usually good as a radio talk show host. It helps to have other people talk, but in monologues, it's not necessary for other people to talk. We've been talking about crypto fiction and the history of how we got from Isaac Newton in 1700 up to here, and I sort of bogged down in the Civil War, and it took a good 60 years from the Civil War before they cemented the Federal Reserve at Jekyll Island and pushed that in so that they could have World War I, which was a prelude to World War II, which was the staging time where they could change everything we knew from history, present it to us in a perspective that only one single generation had to know what was going on and be hiding the past. But how they managed to get an entire generation to collude to hide the past from the future is something that I'd like to know. And it looks like the way they did that was by hiding off the stream of history that's called Tartaria, and that everything that had to do with Tartaria has been washed off the stream of history for the time being. And so now that we're finding some ancient text and some other histories that can be related to this world that do not agree with the conventional narrative finds its time to strike, and that's to switch the conventional narrative on an 80-year cycle to the point where we're headed to space. But we're not headed to space. We're here on a living Earth. And so the question is, how does the living Earth timeline and the space timeline cooperate with each other so that each timeline will be individual with the benefits of starting from similar location, so that they both go into the next rotation to replace the timeline that has left the building, that is perpetual war for perpetual peace, as George Orwell used to call it. The best thing that we've done in the current society is to figure out that Orwell existed and to bring him up in such a way that anybody who has read Animal Farm or 1984 can see the power play that's going on. And if you go back into the history of fiction, recent fiction, not older fiction, that you find that the stories that they tell are all fantasies of what's going to happen in the future, and that's because it has already happened in the past. And so they know how these series are going to align because they've already got that timeline set up so that anybody who enters that timeline and goes into space is not going to be worried about any other timeline except the timeline that they're on. And that's the way that the other timelines manage to lose the population without having a major war that wipes out the population. Now, that's not to say that there won't be any deaths or wars or other things that wipe out significant portions of the population. It's just that there's an alternative way to get rid of population that doesn't involve killing everyone. And so that's preferable to the old way, which was, we don't care, we'll kill everyone and start over. Now, there seems to be something wrong about the mechanism of death. And when people die, they disappear, we bury them in the ground, and we don't give them much thought except on the anniversary of their death, where we go out and put roses on their gravestone or something like that. But in reality, I don't think any of us as individuals actually die in our own reality. I think we just die in everyone else's reality so that it frees us up to go into a tangent reality where everything else is different in a different frame and on a different scale. And that sometimes just the slightest change of difference can trigger a tangent reality. But when you start going on to a tangent reality, there are parallel realities that will bring you back to the main timeline that you were on. So you can get off your main timeline, have a whole series of interactions, then get back onto the main timeline, and you'll find that in that reality you didn't have those interactions. And so those interactions are a way of gaining extra experience to where you can experience the different things that you have to experience while you're experiencing them, and then come back into another reality where those experiences can be applied newly because they didn't really happen within that reality. And that could be the mechanism for upgrading thought, is that in order to upgrade thought, we have to go to realities that have very, very short time constants or very, very long time constants. And most of the realities have time constants that are intermediate, and the intermediate events have already occurred. If you look at a bell-shaped curve and you drop off the first 10% of the curve and the last 10% of the curve, the 80% that is now consistent of the curve above that line that you drew to chop off 10% in either direction is the majority of folks caught up in what's going on that will be going into either space or Armageddon world, where Armageddon world is the result of movies like Blade Runner and The Fifth Element and other things, where whatever you can think of that is dystopic is exactly what's going to happen. But the less time we spend in Armageddon world, the better it is for us, because living Earth is a presupposition that Armageddon world didn't happen, and we're going to have our ability to transform the nature of life on Earth for 1,000 years of peace. And so We just have to smoke a bowl to 1,000-year peace because it seems like something that we should peacefully be doing. I wonder how marijuana got to be so demonized that it's listed on schedule narcotics for the federal government when we understand completely that the endocannabinoid system within people is there for a structural utility. And what I think marijuana does best is it dampens your edges. And that if you've dampened your own edges by smoking and can get into a plane of existence where the flow can flow, you don't have it near as choppy, and that reality actually follows more of a sine wave where you go up and down and up and up and down and down and up. And you get so used to the patterns of up and downs that when the frequency changes and you start doing your pattern a little faster, you don't even notice. But then other people are doing their patterns a little slower if you're doing yours a little faster. And that gap between how much time you have in your time versus how much time other people have within their time is a function of how much intensity you're applying to the situation. So if you are in the moment of now and you're applying your total focus to the moment of now, you have a lot more power in the moment of now than most people who haven't applied their focus. On the other hand, if you want to work outside the moment of now, you have the opportunity to do that by suspending the moment of now. But if you've suspended the moment of now without being able to know how to unsuspend the moment of now, what ends up happening is that your now turns into forever and your brain fogs and you go into a different reality. And so we have many, many different realities for each of us, each set at different frequencies. And the different frequencies are all coordinated so that they have different sizes, and that the different sizes of the different frequencies are such that we can exist in one super large scale, and then 2 smaller scales and 3 smaller scales to that and 5 to that. And as we get deeper and deeper into Fibonacci, from 8 to 13 to 21 to 34 to 55, 89, 144, 144 worlds at the same time, all set at the same frequency initially, which each can vary on their own depending on the variables, will end up giving you 89 of one type and 55 of the other type. And it turns out that some of those 55 of the lesser type aren't quite there in their own tangents. And sometimes the bigger groups are still made up of smaller groups that hold their reality together. And so you have a subgroup within a larger group, and the subgroup takes on a life of its own, and the larger group doesn't even acknowledge the existence of the subgroup until it gets big enough to make waves on its own scale. But when it's big enough to make waves on its own scale, it's taken as something different, not something the same. And so people get very uncomfortable with the concept of different. I think we need to change that. I think we need to expect things to be different and relish when they are different, as opposed to having things be the same old, and so predictable that we can do the walk of life without actually being involved in walking the walk or talking the talk. So we get to the point where we walk our own walk and we talk our own talk, and then we're told, where we go one, we go all. You have to join us and you have to do things our way, or else you are not going to find you acceptable. You have to be in favor of Orange Man, or you have to oppose Orange Man. And if you're in opposition to Orange Man, then you're part of the lame stream. And if you're in pro-Orange Man, then you're part of the alternative stream. But the lame stream and the alternative stream must fight each other because those are the rules of the game. So why don't we just let them stream out completely and not pay any attention to what's going on there? But instead take our intention and put it into our own rabbit holes. And instead of looking at our rabbit hole as a safe place where we are confined in the burrows of what we know, let's start making it so that our rabbit holes cross each other underneath the ground so that we don't have to come up for air and breathe the nonsense that they're feeding us within the videos that currently are there for our watching. And the whole idea of learning by watching is a real problem because I've always found for me that for me to learn best, I have to be immersed in something. And if I can find that immersion and really get involved in it, I can learn the nuance of a game and really be playing it well and not even think that I'm playing the game. But if I have an endeavor that I'm interested in, that I could put other things aside to go deep into that endeavor, I can go so far down a rabbit hole that it leads me to come out in China. But, you know, the rabbit holes are constructed for us by the segregation of information into different components and different professions. So if we each take our own private profession and start asking questions of where it is and how it got to be and what its importance is and whether we can be doing this in the next phase of society, how it affects other people in that, there's a whole lot of depth and knowledge that's so outside the realm of people that the people who've been assigned to it have been brainwashed to believe a system works that's nowhere even clued near where they work, just so that they have it so that they can do their own work without having to fuss with the nuances of the system. And that's where I find the most difficulty working completely outside the system, is when I get people who are inside the system and they know how to follow a logical argument up into the point where the action that it requires seems illogical, and then they melt down. And the reason they melt down is because their illogic is based on legalism, and they've been taught to follow the law, and we don't even have a clue anymore how natural law works. We are under so many different layers of law that people forget if you put your hand onto a hot burner on the stove, you get burned. And logic works that way. There are so many preconditions that we need to have our logic in the form that we get it in, that we tend as individuals to upset ourselves by ignoring a lot of good logic. It just doesn't take a form that we find acceptable. So by immersing myself into a play and being part of it, I can see what's going on in the immersed atmosphere. But when I step back and look at the big picture of where I've been after I've had my immersion, that's where I'm having the difficulties right now. Because the big picture that I see has moved its line away from the big picture that I was seeing a year or two ago. And this is actually a good thing because I didn't like where I really was a year or two ago. Not as a person, I'm very happy where I physically am, but the way the system has tended to portray itself, I was worried about not having influence into the system at all because of credibility issues. But now what I've realized is that the credibility issue is that it's all quite incredible, and that everybody's truth is their own truth, And if you take them at the truth that they speak, everybody is an awesome individual who has a lot to say. If somebody else's truth conflicts with my truth, instead of arguing about whose truth is proper and whose truth is not true, what we should do is be patting ourselves on the back by having different truth pathways that just lead to the same place that gets us closer to absolute truth over relative. But relative truth is based on the foundations of the system we work with. And absolute truth is based on having an absolute knowledge of everything that's going on. And there's so much that we don't understand in the mechanism of how things work, because it can be continually changed in ways that we were taught are impossible. And so if you can do something that's impossible once a day, every day, it will remind you that you live in this reality and that other people might deem things to be impossible that you know better. Instead of arguing with them, just let them think it's impossible and go ahead and do it anyway, the way you were going to do it, and have it work. And don't inform them about how you did it. Just know that it was done. And if everybody's working as individuals, and instead of looking out for personal greed, we're looking out against collective greed, and we're trying to make it so that we represent everything that is a form of life. Very, very anti-Newtonian physics, because Newton, as we said, was creating physics with the purpose of taking life out of physics. And now we're starting with the foundation that we have a living earth, and that we are the students of the living earth, and we are the stewards of the living earth, and that we are learning about earth and taking care of her as she learns to communicate with us. And oh, by the way, all those things that she's going to communicate with, we call microbes and fungi, lichen, and other things that are out in nature that are part of what nature's mechanism is, but they serve as backups to how things work, so that if something goes down that's pretty important for nature, it reshuffles its things and comes back up in a different way. But we've been pumping enough oil for the last 200 years that the lubricant between the tectonic plates is no longer there. And so anytime we get plate shifts, we see earthquakes and volcanoes. And so there's a direct correlation between the pumping of oil and the atmosphere that we have currently and the way the whole world works. And so reinvestigating physics will just have to be the topic of another show, because we here on The New Way on Steampunk Radio with 2 E's, which you're listening to on your TuneIn app, are about to say goodbye for another day. Tomorrow, we will be doing word association games, and that'll be on at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 a.m. Western, 2 o'clock across the pond. Although maybe it's 3 o'clock again, because I do believe they might have changed their clocks to catch up to us changing our clocks. Isn't it ridiculous that we change our clocks every 6 months and throw us off pattern yet again? When are we going to get used to the idea that by keeping regular patterns, we calm everything down and get to the point where our conjunctions are actually in rhyme with the rest of the universe? I'm Dr. Lenny Time. It's been a pleasure talking at you again this morning. We'll see you again tomorrow morning, same bat time, same bat place, and you never know, we might even be on the same bat adventure. And we are off air.